Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about the novel Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Now, I've done videos previously on the play version of Peter Pan and on the play When Wendy Grew Up, which is the short sequel to the stage version of Peter Pan. Both of those are more or less included in the novel, which covers essentially the same set of events, but the novel, in my opinion, even though I'm a drama scholar, the novel actually works a lot better than the play, in part because Barrie's style of writing, especially of writing stage directions, is very novelistic anyway. Like, he's from this era of stage writing. We get people like Bernard Shaw, who are in the same tradition, where the stage directions will often tell you things that you couldn't actually put on stage, things that are internal to a character or something like this. And so the novel makes more sense in that way. It feels like the more natural medium for Barrie in this case. So, a couple of things that I think are really important here. Some of this will overlap with my previous Peter Pan and When Wendy Grew Up videos. Peter Pan is not a good hero. This will come as a surprise to those of us who were sort of first introduced to Peter Pan through, say, the Disney film version or something like this. Peter Pan is a narcissist, he is a psychopath, and he's a dictator. He's really an extraordinarily unpleasant character. And I mean, he's a child, so in some senses, these are the characteristics of children that Barrie is sort of drawing out. But Peter Pan, for as much as he's the hero of the novelist, he's an extraordinarily unlikable character. So, one of the things that's really striking to me about Peter is just how casually violent he is, and how little impression that violence makes on him. So, there's one place that okay, here we go. So, Peter Pan continually murders people, just for fun. Just casually goes out and kills people. In fairness, they're pirates or Native Americans. Parenthetically, Barrie does not use the term Native Americans. He uses a racial slur, the R word, which is quite unpleasant to read continually throughout the novel. I get that people used that term in 1904, I think 1911 is when the novel came out. The play was performed first in 1904. I get that people used that term in 1911, but it's not good. And it's not fun to read, so that's one thing to keep in mind here. But Peter Pan murders people all the time. Yes, they're pirates or they're Native Americans in this Cowboys and Indians, Wild West, Native Americans are vicious warriors bullshit. But we've got here this just very casual attitude toward it. So at one point it says, he often went out alone, and when he came back you were never absolutely certain whether he had had an adventure or not. He might have forgotten it so completely that he said nothing about it, and then when you went out you found the body. And on the other hand, he might say a great deal about it, and yet you could not find the body. So Peter Pan, whose life largely consists of having adventures, those adventures are synonymous with murder. I mean, that's a huge problem. And we actually get this very directly. the last chapter of the novel, like the secondary stage play, is entitled When Wendy Grew Up. And I talked about this line in the play. It's in the novel as well. After Wendy becomes an adult and has her own child, Peter Pan comes back to get her, not realizing that really any time has passed. And she asks him about their adventures with Captain Hook, which are the primary focus of the novel. And he says, "Who is Captain Hook?" he asked with interest when she spoke of the archenemy. "Don't you remember," she asked, amazed, "how you killed him and saved all our lives?" "I forget them after I killed them," he replied carelessly. "I forget them after I kill them." Again, I pointed this out in the video about When Wendy Grew Up. The plural there. We go from Wendy asking about Captain Hook, a singular individual, to the plural, "I forget them after I kill them." So this is a regular part of Peter Pan's life, and it makes no emotional impact upon him whatsoever. And it goes on. When she expressed a doubtful hope, that's Wendy, expressed a doubtful hope that Tinkerbell would be glad to see her, he said, "Who is Tinkerbell?" "Oh, Peter," she said, shocked, but even when she explained, he could not remember. "There are such a lot of them," he said. "I expect she is no more." So one of his best friends, probably dead, and he doesn't remember her. So Peter Pan, psychotic narcissist. And we get this in a number of ways. We get this sort of, but like the other component of it, in addition to him like forgetting murdering people regularly, he reconstructs reality based on what he wants to be the truth. So that's one of the striking dictatorial things about Peter and the way that he controls the Lost Boys. So we get this a number of times with language, where Peter will change the meanings of words to be whatever it is he says that they are. But we also get this with the trees, because in the way that the Lost Boys get down into their underground home is they go through holes in hollow trees, and each boy has his own hole. And what the novel tells us is that Peter would find a hole that would roughly fit you, and then rather than carving the hole out so that it would fit, he would reshape your body so that you would fit perfectly into the existing hole in the tree. So again, this like idea of physically reshaping people in order to get them to conform to what Peter wants them to be, it's part of who he is, and it's a deeply troubling element of him. There's a couple of other things that I think are worth talking about with this novel. And one, I'm going to come back. I'm coming back to something that I talked about before, which is that Barrie seems much more comfortable to me with the novel as a genre than the stage. And the opening paragraph of this novel is an excellent example of that. It's a fantastic opening paragraph because it's got a catchy first line, a famous first line now. But it also introduces us to many of the major themes of the novel without overtly introducing them. So the famous opening line is, "All children except one grow up." Then he goes on, "They soon know that they will grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this. One day when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, 'Oh, why can't she remain like this forever?' This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. So in this opening paragraph, without necessarily overtly establishing it, we get the theme of motherhood, which is central to the novel. We also get the theme of growing up, which is overtly introduced, but it's not didactically introduced. It's introduced as a kind of conflict or realization for the character. And we get the theme of being concerned or afraid about death with the plucked flower and things like this. Because as we all know, when you pluck a flower, it dies fairly quickly. You just keep it alive by put it in water and whatever it is. But that's not the point. The point is that the flower will die. So we have that introduced in a very subtle way here. And so his writing style is quite good. He gives away a lot without overtly giving things away. And that's a very powerful technique that Barrie uses here. The other thing that is interesting about the novel that's really not in the stage version is we get this implication for a long time that Peter is imaginary, that he's a kind of imaginary friend almost, but he's shared between Wendy, John, and Michael. So all 3 of the Darlings' children have this character in their minds. And we get this. The idea of Neverland is introduced as a sort of imaginary place which is different for everyone. And then it says Mrs. Darling at night would go through her children's minds. And this is an interesting thing. It's not entirely clear what Barrie's getting at here, but it's a sort of part of the role of a mother in Barrie's conceptualization here. Sort of go through their minds, order the children's minds so that when they wake up, things are in the right places and whatever it is. Almost treating their minds like their rooms or their nursery or whatever it is. It says, occasionally in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand, and of these quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's mind, while Wendy's began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bolder letters than any of the other words, and as Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. Yes, he is rather cocky, Wendy admitted with regret. Her mother had been questioning her. But who is he, my pet? He's Peter Pan. You know, Mother. At first Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she just remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were odd stories about him, as that when children died he went part of the way with them so that they should not be frightened. She had believed in him at the time, but now that she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. Besides, she said to Wendy, he would be grown up by this time. Oh no, he isn't grown up, Wendy assured her confidently. He's just my size. She meant that he was her size both in mind and body. She didn't know how she knew it. She just knew it. So we have the implication here that Peter Pan is a figment of their imagination, that he is a made-up character who's somehow shared between multiple children. So that element of unreality is introduced in the novel in a way that it simply isn't in the stage play. And it's an interesting difference, especially considering that Peter is in fact a fictional character created by J.M. Barrie, and I think he had like 5 children, 5 brothers that their parents died and he sort of became their guardian, and they would play these games. And I think they, along with Barrie, made up Peter Pan. So it's an interesting shift, because is one of those things. And actually it's somewhat like Barrie's play Mary Rose as well, because this idea of a place that's somewhat imaginary, a person that's somewhat imaginary, and yet can exert influence in the real world, because he takes Wendy, John, and Michael for quite a long time. Like, they're gone for quite a while. And so, I mean, he's clearly real, but he also exists in the mind.